Howdy, this is Mackenzie Franklin from SideGame LLC here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Today I want to talk to you about Tsukuyumi Full Moon Down, the recently delivered Kickstarter from King Raccoon and Gray Fox Games. This is the miniatures edition of the game, and I wanted to give you my thoughts and kind of an overall rundown of the game, and ultimately my decision onto whether it is going to be staying in the library or not. So this is my review for that and the cooperative and solo expansion. Now that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, the first thing, let's quickly overview. Not going to go through all the rules because there are a lot in this game, particularly with the asymmetry of the game. You're going to be playing as one of these factions here, and each faction is going to have a setup on the back here where you're going to be putting out your starting location. It's one of these large tiles, and you'll be putting some control markers around the tiles that you start with. And the whole goal of this game is to get those control markers on the board so that you can earn some points. Now, each faction is extremely different with the way they're going to operate. They have a number of units that all have different attack values, conquer values, and health values, their own personal goal that they can achieve, as well as special faction effects, difficulty rating, all sorts of things. This one in particular, the Nomad faction, they have all these cool weapon tokens that they can spend to get additional attack buffs based on the number of people that are in that combat. Each one can use a weapon. They're very cool. And then each of those characters will also come with their own stat cards. That way everybody can use this as a reference to see what the values of the different characters are. Now, the gameplay is very straightforward. You're going to have these action cards, and you'll be having 6 at the start of the game. And each round, you're going to be choosing one of those action cards in your hand. Then you'll pass the remaining to the player on your left. Now, when you choose an action card, all the backs are the same. They'll give you some form of actions here. You'll get to do 2 different ones. But on the back, they're separated into phases. So the card that you pick, you're going to do this one first. Everybody will do this in initiative order up here. And then you're going to do the green phase here and then the red phase. So after everyone picks their action cards, everybody puts it face down, and then going in that initiative order, you're going to be resolving your actions. So you can do event cards, you can produce units, or just units or these troops here, or you can also move to combat. Now, combat's pretty integral, and we'll talk about that in a second. After everyone does their white phase, you'll flip your cards, and then you'll do your blue phase, then your green, and then your red. So the blue generally is using your ability, maybe moving the initiative, getting events. The green usually is producing things and moving and attacking with the Oni on their board. In the competitive version, these are a kind of a neutral faction that you can send and sick on your opponents, and they all have their own stat cards here that you can use and attack. So they're pretty cool. You can summon them as well as use them to attack and move around the board. That way you can influence this area control that's happening here. Now after that, you go into the combat phase where you can move your units around, and then you can attack with those units. Now, the attack is very interesting in this game. Each character has their own set of these combat cards, and they're going to choose one of them to play during fights. So they have some that will give you conquest actions, which will allow you to place your control markers on the board. And then you have some that will allow you to annihilate, and these actually remove units. This will cause damage. And each of those units here has an attack value here, and that's what you'll actually use to kill units. Their health, which is the damage that you take, that's what's going to be reduced. And then you have the conquer value, and this is what it's going to let you put out those control markers. So very cool with the different cards here, and each card is different for each faction. There's also these once per round actions that are very strong, like this one lets you do a conquest and an annihilation. Now, after you play the card, you'll kind of resolve it to its full potential. The person that you're attacking is going to resolve one of these counterattack actions. And I think that's kind of cool. Your opponent's going to take the card, and then they'll resolve whatever they want to do. Generally, most factions are going to have some sort of defense action that they can use here, but a lot of times they'll also get a health bump or something, but it's based on that player to decide how they want to resolve all of these actions. After the combat stuff is done, then you'll go to the end of the round, and at the end of 5 rounds, the game is over, and whoever has the most victory points wins the game. At the end of the game, you're going to get extra points for each of these control markers on the board. You get 1 point each. If you're on these extra spaces, you'll get 2. And then you'll also score extra points based on all of the points you've accumulated, as well as your position on this initiative track and some other things. But the big thing is you want to get these control markers out. That way you can score those victory points. It's a very straightforward process with a lot of choice here in the action cards. Now, for my thoughts on the game, initially, I want to talk about my favorite things in this game. My favorite things are the asymmetry. I think this is so cool, so fun. Each character is very different. A lot of characters will have a card of information back here that are going to detail all of the tokens. I love that each unit has a faction effect. So when you play those action cards, your cards become different because of that faction effect. And I think that's really neat because some of these action cards won't have that. And maybe if your faction effect's not that good, you could ignore those. And I really like that. In addition, some of the units are going to have more units than others. So you might have like the boars here. They have 6 different types of units, but you've got the blue guys here with their 7, and each unit is going to behave differently. My favorite faction has to be the Cyber Samurai here. I think they're super neat. I love the idea of getting these upgrade cards, these uplinks, and there are ways that you can spend your supply to get special player abilities. I think that's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of cool choices here, and some of those uplinks even involve you summoning more units. So I really like these guys. They're really fun, very dynamic in the way they work. So I really like that. And unfortunately, that's kind of where my things that I really love end, with that asymmetry. So I really like the way that the asymmetry works, but everything else in the game just seems kind of subpar to me. This isn't one that I'm ever going to pick off the shelf, and there's a few reasons why. Now, the first reason that I want to mention is just this miniature edition of the game. This could be completely cosmetic because all of that information is on these cards here. So you're constantly referencing the miniatures and the cards here, and notice the numbers. There's a lot of math to look at these things, and unless they're painted, it's going to be very hard to tell which unit is which. I mean, I'll hold up a handful of these here. Can you tell which is which? Obviously, this is a little biased because I'm not showing the information on the camera here, but it is very difficult when playing in the game to kind of look at the board and understand what is what, and having to kind of file through all of these sheets based on the players who are playing. It can be very difficult and tedious to calculate a simple battle. And that's another thing that I want to talk about is the combat, where the big thing here is you have lots of combat options here, but really you're going to be primarily using the conquest option, because what you're doing with the conquest is putting out these markers, and that's how you win the game, is with these markers, with victory points. So actually attacking the enemy units ends up being a waste of your attack cards, because remember, these cards are being drafted, and you're going to be drafting those ones with high combat values. So you're going to be taking the 4s, the 3s, the 2s, and you're going to be getting those and trying to get the high values, because ultimately this is not a very high scoring game. You're going to be wanting to put out these markers as frequently and as soon as possible onto different areas. The other big issue I have with this are the action cards themselves. So once again, in these action cards, there is not a huge amount of variance, and really the only thing you're caring about is down here. A lot of the times these action cards will take a while to go through, so the game tends to drag quite a bit because of the way the actions are set up. Now, I do like the way the initiative works in interaction with these. I love that you're able to do each phase, and it's easy to track on the cards, but ultimately the cards and the actions themselves take a lot of time to calculate and to actually be able to perform. Even something as simple as getting 2 units here, or moving some Oni, or moving them around. And then the attacking itself also takes quite a bit of time, because that opponent does have to resolve that action here. Now, like I said before, the attacking, you're pretty much going to want to be conquesting all the time. So a lot of this cool asymmetry from the other things are not really going to be used very often, because realistically, it's just not that powerful as opposed to any of your things that allow you to conquer, which is very unfortunate, because this seems like a great system, but what you're doing is actually pretty lacking. It can be very unsatisfying when you spend, 3 minutes calculating your units, figuring out what weapons to use, and then the result of it is simply placing a marker and saying, okay, I've got my 1 point there, but nothing has actually changed. And I find that a little bit frustrating, particularly when there's so much math and so much referencing when it comes to the miniatures. There are standees available for the game that will have the information printed on it, but that is not this version. And even with that, I feel that would still be that same challenge to take time and add up all the numbers and make sure things correct in order to ultimately place that single marker on the board. Now, as soon as the players reveal their action cards, you can very much calculate the abilities and the potential points that you can get. So once the rounds start getting further and further, it's very easy to kind of look at what everybody else is doing and be able to count out things. And if you're playing for the win, this might be the thing that you do to ensure that you're going to claim victory. And once again, that will bog down the game, and it essentially will have some forms of player elimination, because when you're doing these combat actions at certain points, it'll get to a time where you just don't have the time to summon things and move them and actually use them to conquer specific areas. Another thing I dislike are the event cards here. A lot of the times when you draw event cards, they're pretty subpar, whether it be turning a tile or simply moving one space up or down an initiative track. A lot of these effects are very weak, and they are unfortunately just not that powerful. That being said, there are a couple of cards that are very powerful, like get an extra combat action. But unfortunately, there's only one of these combat action cards in this entire event deck. So it can feel very lackluster when you're unable to do anything with your combat actions and you're actually having to dig and try to grab them. So a little frustrating when it comes to the event deck. I've seen many people compare this game to Inish in the way that the combat works, where you are simply removing troops, but I think that there's just so much math involved in this game where that simplistic outcome of combat is not worth the immense calculations that are required to pull it off. As I said before, I will never pick this over pretty much any area control that exists, whether it be something as big as Blood Rage or Rising Sun or Ankh, or whether it be something smaller like a Ginkopolis or Yellow and Yangtze, another form of this small area control gaming. Now with that being said, let's quickly talk about the Rise of the Moon Princess expansion and the solo mode. Before getting rid of this game, I wanted to make sure that I gave a fair shake to the cooperative and solo mode in the expansion. Now that being said, the solo mode is extremely short. It's about 3 rounds, and instead of playing with the standard action cards, you're going to be playing with these Moon Princess action cards. You start the round off by revealing one of these effect cards, and they're going to show some spawning rules as well as a round goal that you can use to make some extra points. You're going to be populating some characters on the board, and then you'll have this large Moon Princess miniature that's going to sit on the board in these vertices here, and that's going to be in these 3 areas, and it will be trying to attack and control those areas. Now, instead of the base game, you'll be using these special action cards, and you'll be drawing 3, and you'll be picking one of those and discarding the other 2. If you're playing with more players than 2, then instead you're going to be drafting these like you would in the regular game. Now these are very similar where instead of having the separate phases, you're going to be having just one large phase, and you'll combine them all into one phase. But first you start off with this side, and it's kind of like the standard white actions on these other cards. So you'll do a Moon Princess action, and that's going to involve you pulling one of these cards and resolving its effects. It's generally going to have the princess move and do something, and then it's going to do your actions as in the base game. Now here is where the severity of this happens is generally you're going to be doing that simplicity that's in the base game, right? Which is great because, you know, your turns are very quick in the solo mode, but the upkeep and the amount of things you're going to be having to do for the opponent are ridiculous, particularly in the solo mode. So you have this thing up here that is called the momentum tracker. In a one-player game, it is simply 9 spaces. And the way it works is you have this little thing here, and every time you satisfy a condition, you'll have to move this. Now, the first way that you move this is if you attack any space with the legendary Oni or the princess here, and that will push you up 1 here. And then if you play a combat card against an Oni, you have to move it. And then if you also at any time kill Oni, and that's separate from killing these large Onis, then you'll move it. So in a single combat, if you're just trying to take out units, you potentially will move this thing 3 times, which is pretty insane if we're being honest, because in a single player game, there's only 9 of these, and you're moving it from 1 to 4 in that first turn. Every time you hit one of these purple cards, you're going to be revealing one of these effects. And these are going to be either permanent effects that do something, like this one eliminates your faction effect, or can give you a special event that'll just trigger. This one just gives you 3 more momentum. And as you can see, they're not particularly well scaled, because if you're playing that one-player mode, all of a sudden your single attack, which will put you up here, will all of a sudden make you go up 3 more, and you've transcended the whole track with simply 1 small combat, whether it be killing 1 unit here or trying to just control an area. And I find that extremely frustrating because you can tell that it's just not scaled well to the player count here. It's extremely frustrating, and you're often playing for the AI for more than you would ever be playing on your turn. I feel that when we play this game, the solo or cooperative mode, you're just not taking your turn. You are constantly playing for the enemy, and I find that extremely frustrating. In addition to that, the enemy AI has its own victory point conditions here that it's going to get, but the rate at which it's putting things out and responding via its track here, it becomes very frustrating very quickly to try to satisfy those conditions. You also have a lot of these cards that will just make victory impossible for you. For example, this Dragon Wakes here, it prevents you from even entering the moon if it's the last round of the game, which could totally make it impossible for you to reclaim control of any of the spots. You're very much at the mercy of this game. I believe that the randomness is too much, as well as the upkeep and just everything around this solo mode. So I would not recommend the solo or cooperative mode for this as well, because I do think that it strips away the interesting choices when it comes to the drafting, the timing, as well as reduces the amount of asymmetry that you'll get with these modifications in the form of these modification cards. So unfortunately, you'll be losing a lot of that creativity and interesting decisions, and you're going to basically be playing the AI's turn for the majority of the game and really be at the mercy to it without much to plan for and to react to. It's very frustrating and not something that I recommend. And in addition, all the math from the base game is still there, but now you're having to reference not only the abilities on the cards, but also the abilities on the actual reference cards for the different Oni, and you'll be stacking those two different special abilities on top of reading the miniatures as well. So you have to pick and choose your battles here. Do you help a tad bit and use the standees, or do you use the miniatures to keep everything cohesive? And in exchange for doing that, you're going to have to constantly reference things. So I do not recommend the solo or cooperative mode, and honestly, I cannot recommend Tsukuyumi Full Moon Down, particularly the miniatures version. Now, there's a lot of people who stand by playing the standard edition of the game where you're playing with the standees. It reduces those problems that I had talked about when it comes to having to use these reference cards to take a look at values. But for me, even if that was not a problem, I think that just the action system as a whole, the amount of calculation and the math in general for really, really low output of results is really not worth it to me. Unfortunately, this is not going to be staying in the library. It's one that we are going to be getting rid of, and so we'll list it as soon as I upload this video. I'm going to de-sleeve everything and get it out of here. But I'd love to hear what you think about Tsukuyumi Full Moon Down. Is this one that you've played? Is this one that you have any interest in? Have you played the standee version? Have you given it multiple tries? If you have, what are the factions you enjoy playing? For me, I've really enjoyed the Hive. The Nomad faction is very cool. I like how they're very aggressive with fighting with their weapons. But once again, when it came to the end of the day, I was honestly only using this Conquest and this Assume a Position action, or the guerrilla attack here, trying to make sure I am conquesting as opposed to annihilating and actually using my full attack force. So unfortunately here, this is not one that we're keeping, but thank you so much for watching and sticking around to the end here. Side game strong.